In Miami, soaring housing prices are changing the landscape. Now, many of the Latin American immigrants that call the city home find themselves on the streets with no place to go. Nitza Soledad Perez reports.
In the shadows of an ever-growing city lives a struggling homeless population of undocumented immigrants. Miami continues to see a rise in homelessness, many of them newcomers chasing an American dream, but instead finding dead ends in a maze of misery.
There's no question the population is increasing. Some of it's first-time homelessness, some of it's chronic. And then the second piece of it is you've got an immigrant population that are making their way here. They're not all on the buses from Texas to Connecticut and Texas to New York. Contrary to popular belief, people are getting here in other ways. They're getting here on buses, they're getting here in cars, they're getting here. And all of them don't have relatives here.
Juan David Moreno is just 23 years old. He was born in Medellin, Colombia. He first traveled to Spain with a brother in search of opportunities. When that wasn't working out, he moved on and landed here in Miami last December.
I haven't been able to find a job here in Miami, nor anyone that can help me. Shelters are not accepting people. They won't let me in. They barely help. So I have no other option but to be out here.
He says his passport and identification cards were stolen while he slept in this area. Without proper documentation, he can't legalize his immigration status. Juan David says he's just tired of knocking on doors.
I've even stopped the police right here and asked them to help me get deported.
Juan David tells us that the police refused to help with his deportation. He also says that the Consulate of Colombia has not responded to his pleas for help. Without money or papers, his options are very limited.
I'd honestly prefer to be back in Colombia. Over there, at least they're good or bad. I can get an ID, I can find a job in whatever, and at least I can survive. Not like here, on the streets, sometimes without taking a bath, going through hardship. It's so much that sometimes I feel like I'm going crazy. It's very difficult, really. I've never been through anything like this, and I definitely never imagined I would end up on the streets.
Every Tuesday, a team of volunteers from a local church brings food and fellowship to the homeless here. The Tuesday when we met, Juan David even got a haircut. He smiled at me while sharing his story, but it was a pained smile, like a mask worn by a young man, barely hanging on. Nitza Soledad Perez, CGTN, Miami.
Okay, to talk more about the ongoing homeless issues in the United States, we're joined by Joseph Williams, former senior editor at U.S. News and World Report. Joseph, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming in. And this is a story that has no easy answer. We could do 15 stories, have a million different issues that lead to homelessness. You and I see it every day walking around this area. Let's talk about the recent growth in unhoused people across U.S. metro areas. I mean, what has led to this recent spike?
You've had a confluence of unfortunate events, starting with some economic downturns. I mean, this dates back as far back as you want to take it, but certainly in recent years, the economic downturn in 2007, a lot of people lost their homes. Moving forward, some of them might have got stabilized, but then along came the pandemic, which some people lost their jobs because offices shut down, they weren't able to get to work, or they were getting to work to jobs that barely paid the rent when things were becoming more expensive. And then on the heels of the pandemic, you have the recession, rather, I beg your pardon, not the recession, but the rise in inflation, which made prices more expensive. Even housing rent prices became more expensive, and it just built one on top of the other on a crisis that was already a slow motion disaster in most American cities.
Slow motion disaster, I think that's a very apt term. And I really think we probably should have focused a little more on mental illness in those last two pieces. They're wonderful pieces, but you can't cover everything. And just walking around the city, it's heartbreaking to see people who are clearly in need of treatment.
Well, and that goes back to the 1980s and deinstitutionalization. Ronald Reagan was in charge. He was the president and led a campaign to have mental institutions either shut down or release people who have been there for years and years and years. And that led to a more challenging situation for people who are experiencing crisis to get the mental health treatment that they need. And this is another layer of the disaster when you're talking about people who need services but either don't have health care, can't get access to health care, or do the revolving door situation where you go into an emergency room, get stabilized, they turn you back out on the street. You talk to almost any homelessness expert, and they will tell you that the key to solving substance abuse and solving mental health crises are stable housing. You get somebody a place to go to, a place to live where they feel safe. That's when recovery and healing can begin.
You know, I did a homeless story here years ago, and I remember one thing one young man said to me, and he said, I look around, I see all these doors in this city, and they're all closed to me. Talk about the spread that we're seeing now to suburban and even resort areas.
Well, it's because people are getting pushed out. You have encampments that are getting raised by cities and by officials who are frankly frustrated and unable to find a way to deal with this problem. Housing has become more expensive in cities as gentrification takes place, pushing people further out to inner ring suburbs, then further suburbs, and even you have some people who were once considered middle class who have either fallen victim to inflation, the recession, joblessness, high medical bills. They can't afford to pay the rent. They can't afford to pay the mortgage. They get turned out as well. You have people sleeping in their cars. My parents live in a rural part of Maryland, and there are homeless people there too, mainly because they can't find work. They can't find stable housing. There's even fewer resources in rural areas than there are in cities, and the ones in cities are cash strapped in the best of times.
Yeah, indeed. Do you think that people just turn a blind eye and want to hope that this goes away? What do you think local businesses are doing? What about local governments?
Local businesses are frustrated. You talk to any person who has somebody sleeping in their doorway in the morning, and it's a bad look for businesses. Several businesses have decamped from downtown DC because they're tired of dealing with the problem. So they're frustrated. I think they have an innate sort of compassion for homeless people, but the problem is so big and so seemingly intractable that compassion wears thin, especially when you have to step around a camp or step over somebody or step past someone who is asking you for change, and you just either feel frustrated or unable to cope, and so you keep moving on. So I think people innately feel for folks who are unhoused, but the problem is so big and it feels so unable, they feel so unable to help or even make a dent that it's very, very frustrating. And so the only option is to keep it moving and to try to deal with your own life.
You know, you and I have reported long enough. We remember the first George Bush saying we want a kinder, gentler nation. Well, one could argue it's certainly not there right now. Break down the Biden administration's latest initiative, the likelihood of success, and if the GOP moves into power, things get even worse?
Well, the Biden administration has plans to eradicate homelessness by incentivizing more affordable housing, incentivizing the building of more affordable housing, rent subsidies, different other plans to get people off the streets. Some municipalities are even considering, like in one of the earlier pieces, converting abandoned hotels. And even now that we have an office space glut, there's some people even talking about converting that to affordable housing. However, this is a problem that will not go away overnight, and a lot of these plans are just kind of nibbling at the edges. It's going to require concerted effort and a lot of money. We're talking affordable housing that people can actually afford on a minimum wage salary. People don't want that because it lowers property values, so you have to buy land, which is becoming more expensive, and it just goes on and on and on. And Republicans are really loath to spend money in general, and they're loath to spend it on the poor in particular because it seems like a handout to a lot of people. So the problem is kind of a Mobius strip where you get one corner of it solved and another two pop up, and it just seems more and more distressing.
Yeah, we wish we had better news to report, but thank you for shining that light on it, though, Joseph. We certainly appreciate your time, as always.
My pleasure.